So now I want to move on just to talk about, that was sort of an overview of the paradigm, and within the 5 minutes left to me, I just want to talk really quickly about, is this a new paradigm? What's a new paradigm? Drawing on the idea of Thomas Kuhn's scientific revolution and paradigms, that old tools and methods of doing research no longer answer current questions, and emerging facts make less sense. There are more anomalies in the existing paradigm. And out of that emerges disputes as the scientific revolution occurs, although there may be prolonged generational conflict. And then Kuhn says the scientific community coalesces around new questions and new tools for answering them. In particular, the world is seen in some sense differently as a consequence of new methods and theories. The term paradigm can refer either to the general disciplinary matrix or to the specific exemplars of research. So to think about, okay, is there a new paradigm coming out of the current moment, and is mobilities research part of that? Well, some of the emerging, the facts that are sort of making less sense, I would say that in that sort of 10 years ago, in that period, there was a sense in which there were some large-scale mobilities that were not simply new, but that they had features that were new, which was that the contemporary scale of fast movement around the world seemed to be intensifying. There's a diversity of mobility systems now in play. The self-expanding automobility system was sort of showing more and more risks and problems, and there became to be an entanglement of physical movement and communications. There was also a feeling that mobility domains were bypassing national societies, and a significance of movement in contemporary governmentality, especially regarding borders, trafficking, and migration. There were also many authors thinking about the importance of multiple mobilities for people's social and emotional lives, kind of living in mobility and mobile lifestyles. And there was also this generating proliferation of many crises, such as climate change, peak oil, offshoring, and various urban crises. So in that sort of period, there was a sense in which there were these new mobility complexes and new questions emerging out of that, and that possibly existing social scientific methods were not providing the answer to these problems. So, let's see, I said that already. I'm going to just keep moving ahead. So, so we feel like there was this kind of triple crisis of the climate crisis and the emergence of new low-carbon practices, such as post-car, off-grid living, renewable energy, sharing economies, car-free city movements. There's been, over this last 10 years, a sort of change in social practice around mobilities, and a fear of disaster and systems failure that's been driving calls for adaptation, resilience, and systems innovation. There's also, of course, been the energy crisis and the need for us to move away from high-carbon cities. And thirdly, you could say also a kind of urban crisis in which urbanism is increasingly understood as a complex, emergent global system of networked connections, and that there's a sort of conflict between dominant mobility regimes and critical counter-practices. So all of this is coalescing around new questions and tools, a kind of new urbanism, which looks at shifts in transport policy in cities, new fuel systems for cars, new materials, smart vehicles, deprivatizing cars, smart card technologies, new social practices around cars. So this is just one example of a realm in which we feel like there is this new mobilities paradigm, both in terms of the problems addressed, the questions being asked, the tools for addressing it, and the sense of a complex system shift. So this is partly why we want to talk about a new mobilities paradigm, and I'll just conclude by just asking, has the new mobilities paradigm been affecting a shift within not just transport, travel, and tourism, but much more broadly across social science? Within which scientific communities has it been operating and transforming? What and where is the scientific revolution, if there is one? Can existing social science disciplines be subject to scientific revolution, and has mobilities begun to affect that? Where will it get us to? And that's partly why we've invited you all here today to talk about that impact of the paradigm on your own work, on the field in which you're working, And we could look at measurements of things like citations and what journals the paradigm has been published in, and the emergence of a publishing network, including not just the Mobilities Journal, but the book series, Changing Mobilities, the journal Transfers, and another book series, Explorations in Mobility, and apparently a new journal coming from Routledge that Sven and Milena are involved in, that will be called, can I announce, Applied Mobilities. So many publications, research centers, and professorships. Here's some of the publications just to give a sample of this kind of burgeoning field over the last 10 years. And we want to do more of a sort of quantitative glance at all the different things that have been coming out, some of the research centers that have been involved, and ones which have created professorships in things like mobilities research, sustainable mobilities, and research labs on mobility, and conferences and professional networks. Many of you have been to some of these conferences. This is just a sampling, but we have the Cosmobilities Network, the Pan-American Mobilities Network, the Mediterranean Mobilities Network. They all hold, and T2M hold annual or biannual conferences. So that's the kind of, this is the sort of realm we're looking at. Fields that have been affected, and some of you may feel you're associated with some of these fields, and maybe I've left out your field, but you know, different aspects of geography, urban studies and planning, tourism, anthropology, media and communication, architecture and design, history, border studies, surveillance studies, migration studies. So this is some of the areas in which we feel there's been this movement of mobilities theory into these different realms. So finally, is there a different kind of social science for the future? The new mobility paradigm helped develop new theory and methods that are transdisciplinary and in some ways have been experimental and creative. It reveals just how social practices and institutions are mobility dependent and are striated by uneven mobilities and different kinds of access to motility. It's reaching new publics, and particularly by ensuring that social science engages with transitions to low carbon mobilities. It develops an ethical stance toward mobility justice, and it implicates social science in new critiques, for example, the unmaking of unsustainable and unjust mobilities, such as offshoring, which John has written about in his book on offshoring. So I will end there, and I just hope that that helps open up some of the kind of questions and topics and intersections and possibly tangents or critiques, and you know, maybe you want to come back and say, well, my field actually doesn't intersect in that way with mobilities, and we think of it differently, and this is what we're talking about. So we would love your feedback, responses as we move through the couple of days workshop. And I know, Sven, you've been assigned as a discussant, but there's not a lot of time, but if you want to raise a couple of questions or points, reactions, feel free.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for